Okay, so we're interviewing David Hunter in the home of Russell Kerrison in Victory Pocket on Saturday the 5th of October 2013. Got that right for once, I usually get the date wrong.
And interviewing you is John MacArthur and myself, Janina Gostea. Sorry, thought you were going to skip it.
I nearly was, yeah. So, David, we've talked to you a little bit about our project for the Australian Research Council doing an oral history of Queensland architecture, and we have a number of kind of standard questions that we've been asking everybody about how they came to study architecture and so on. So we'd like to go through those and talk to you about your later career as far as it's relevant. A particular interest today is to look at, Janina and I are writing a paper about student activism, student culture in the period, and we're particularly interested in the period from the student conference of 1967 through to Art Week in 1972, and I guess the way in which students saw the political issues at the time, at state government level, at international level, the Vietnam War, and how they saw that related to their own education.
Okay.
But if we start perhaps with asking how you came to study architecture and when you began.
I think that my mother had quite an influence on me when I was young. The house that I was born in was designed by Athol Bretnell in Clayfield, and then he subsequently did another house for us in Hendra, and my mother and I would visit this construction site frequently, and I was kind of fascinated by the process of building a house. Now, I was young at that stage. I was in grade 1, grade 2 when that was going on, and I loved the smell of fresh cut timber. And the contractor, the builder, whose name was Elms, really showed me what they were doing and so on. And in fact, when I was older, I think it was maybe when I was in my senior year at high school, I actually spent a couple of days with him on site when he was building a house somewhere, and so I got some insight into that. But also, my mother was forever making notes about things that she thought worked in places that we stayed. Sometimes it might have been at a caravan park, and we were in a caravan, and Mum would do this little sketch of where the sink was and where the stove was and stuff like that, and so on. And so I guess from an early age I was conscious of that. And then in elementary school, I was at Eagle Junction State School, and we did manual training. In those days, the girls did domestic science, and I was not bad at woodwork, but I particularly enjoyed the shop drawing, the geometrical drawing aspect of that. So I think that was kind of a thing that led me towards. I wasn't particularly artistic. I don't think I could draw particularly well, but I had a consciousness of buildings and of kind of what architects did to make that happen. Mm. So I think they were the early influences that led me to that. The thing I think that made a significant difference was that from high school I got a state government scholarship in architecture. I think there were 2 awarded each year, one by the Department of Works and one by the Housing Commission. Mm-hmm. And my scholarship was with the Housing Commission, so it was the full boat ride. They paid fees and a book allowance, plus a monthly stipend, and so that was pretty attractive for parents if you won that kind of a scholarship. Mm. It took a financial load off them, but it also gave me some flexibility that otherwise I wouldn't have had. It meant, for example, that I didn't need to find a job to support myself. I was living at home with my parents, but even so. Mm. And it meant that I had some spending money, because I was getting this weekly, it wasn't much, it was about £6 or whatever money we were using those days. But that was a lot of money. And so when I went to conferences interstate, and everyone was cramming into a beat-up VW. You know, I was able to fly, which then meant I had much more time to do things when I got there and so on. So that was a real. I was very fortunate to have that. But I think that's where it all came from.
And which was the year you started?
My first year was 1966.
And did you complete the degree?
No, yes, 13 years later. I got my. Hamish Murison shook my hand on, I think it was April the 6th, 1979.
Right. And where was the gap? Where did you take the gap?
Well, in 1966, the course was 3 years full-time and 3 years part-time, 6-year course. And, but the students who came the year after me were the first in the 5-year course. 3 years full-time, a year off, and then 2 years full-time. And frankly, after I'd spent some time during the university vacation in the Housing Commission, I wasn't particularly looking forward to spending 3 years there, 4th, 5th and 6th year, working during the day and going to school at night.
And you were bonded to them in the
yes,
terms of your scholarship?
I had a bond, and so I was required to work, I don't remember how long it was, but after that. And this full-time course looked pretty attractive. And so I kind of arranged to fail design in 3rd year and had to repeat. I got credit for everything else, and so I had a reasonably light year, but that's how I fell back with the students who started in 1967. And what happened then was I had the year off when I worked with the Housing Commission full-time in 1970. Came back in 1971. But at that time I had struck up a relationship with Michael Bryce and started, in fact Michael and I formed a graphic design studio in his office in the Wool Exchange in Eagle Street. And that to me was much more exciting than the university course at that time. And so I worked with Michael right up until I left in 1979. But at some point along the way I got a letter from the administration saying, your credits are about to expire. If you want to take advantage of the work that you've already done, you need to come back and finish. So I did in the late 70s and then finally graduated in 1979.
Who do you recall as your teachers? Who was teaching you and who was important for you?
Yeah, on the design side it was Ian Cinnamon. I think he was our kind of year master or whatever for design was called, and Peter O'Gorman. Pat Moroney, who was full-time, part-time, I'm not sure what it was, but Pat was in there as well. Others that I remember, Colin Wright was a tutor. Graham DeGrucci, of course. Not in the early years, I think Graham in 3rd year. And then Bill Gregg was there. Hamish Murison, I think, arrived at some point after we did. It's also during that time that Lewis Keeble, is that correct? Lewis Keeble, the planner?
Yes, that's right.
Came on. I think he was the first kind of dedicated person to town planning.
Yes, that's right. He was the professor of planning.
Yeah, he started off as a reader, and I think, so there's some of the names. And of course, Don Simpson in the workshop.
But Don too.
And was Bill Carr there?
Oh, Bill Carr, of course. How could you forget Bill Carr? Bill was a major influence on students.
Murphy Edwards, was he teaching it?
Murphy Edwards, yes.
Stan Marcus Kyle.
Stan Marcus Kyle was still there, had not retired. But Professor Cummings, and I think retired in 1966. And Bruce Lucas maybe the same time.
Same year.
Yes. And I don't know that I had lectures from either of them. I think they were lecturing to the upper...
So the head of school would have been Gareth Roberts when you...
Not at that time, no. Gareth came in 68, as I remember. Okay. Somebody who served as interim, I think in 67.
And who do you remember as your significant contemporaries? Who were the people in your group who went on to do things that you thought were interesting?
There were some students who just seemed to have it naturally. Ashley Talbot was one. And John Petrie, I think, was another one. These are guys who could draw. And so those of us who couldn't draw kind of felt challenged in that area. As I said, I'm not sure if I mentioned on the video here, but we were saying before that it was a large class.
Mm.
There were 72 students in that year. 71 of them were male, and one, Carol Campbell Brown, was the only female.
Did she finish?
I believe so. Carol, in fact, had been at my high school and she was an outstanding student. I remember high school, and it was actually awkward, early on for her, I think, and for all of us. It just the imbalance was so great. But she was a strong woman.
Did you later take any other tertiary study?
No, I didn't.
And you mentioned the practice you worked in with the state works and housing.
Housing, yes. My scholarship was the Housing Commission, but the way that it was set up was that during vacations in 1 year, I think it was first year I was with the Housing Commission, second year I was with the Works Department, and third year the Housing Commission, and so on. So they set it up so that you would get experience in both places, but then after you graduated, you would spend the bond period with the one that awarded you the scholarship in the first place. And I never got to that point for reasons we might get onto.
And you didn't work for other practices beyond that?
No, well, except for Michael,
yeah,
with Michael
Bryce,
yes.
Yeah.
And at the Housing Commission, who was there at the time? Were there other students?
Yeah, there are other students there. Let me think about that for a minute. Yeah, there were students ahead of me who had the same kind of scholarship, and I think one or two who followed beyond. David Pronger was Pronger. David Pronger was the student who got the Works Department scholarship at the time that I got the Housing Commission scholarship. Let me reflect on that.
And what projects, do you remember the projects that you were working on?
At the Housing Commission?
Mm-hmm.
It was really straightforward stuff. In those days, the Housing Commission designed a tract, and all of the front facades were in a line down the street. I mean, it was terrible stuff. And I think that was one reason I didn't do very well there, and I'm not sure that they were sad when I decided to move on.
So we'll come back to the student issues, but what happened next? What kind of career did you make after studying and you moved to the United States?
When I started working with Michael, he was starting to do some graphic design work. And it was partly graphic design work that was associated with the architectural projects he was doing. And I think the thing that kind of moved it forward was that he had done new offices for some attorneys, some solicitors. Clark and Cam, I think it was, in Queen Street or somewhere. And in their lobby, they needed this display board with all of the companies that were registered in their office. And so that became part of the design process for Michael. And he thought, well, they're going to need new stationery as well. I wonder if they, why don't I design them their stationery and other stuff? And so he did, and other people saw this, and it was very different because in those days solicitor stationery was very traditional, and the design that Michael did was very different. It had some life to it. And then a few other solicitors saw this stuff and said, well, will you do stationery for us? And eventually Michael started to get a name for being able to do this, and also to marry it with interiors and stuff. And that was about the point that I hit with him. And so we started a graphic design studio, and we actually went out looking aggressively for graphic design jobs. And I'm not sure exactly when it was, but in the early 70s there was a recession as well, and architects were doing other things to try to feed the family. And it was actually the graphic design work that kept us going, because the architectural side dried up. And so we got quite a reputation. In fact, we were really the only dedicated graphic design business in Brisbane at that time. Michael and I were instrumental in setting up a Queensland chapter of the what was then called the Industrial Design Institute of Australia. He became the first president, the first member in Queensland of that. I became the second, and that was both by examination. You had to submit a folio and so on. It wasn't just that you sent in a cheque for your dues. We had to put together, serious a portfolio of our work, and so then he and I really got this Queensland chapter of the Institute moving, and encouraged other people in other fields. A furniture designer and like Eddie Codd, I think, joined that, and interior designers and so on. And so we were very active in that. So I spent most of my time from 1971 on either in the graphic design area, occasionally associated with an architectural project, but oftentimes completely independent of that, or in a conference planning thing. And what happened there was really a turning point for me, because we got a call one day from, it was either Peter Livingston or David McConnell, who are anaesthetists. And McConnell lived in a house that was designed by Bob Collum, I think. And they were responsible for running this, what's called an annual general meeting of the Australian Society of Anaesthetists, and wanted a logo. And Bob Collins suggested that we could help them with that. So they came in the office and sat down, we have a chat, and say, yeah, we can do that, and we tell them what it's going to cost and so on. And after they left, I remember saying to Michael, listen, these guys need other stuff as well. They need help organising the social events and the registration thing and all this kind of stuff, because they were going to get their wives to do it. So in fact, we then put a proposal to them to manage the conference. And they accepted it, and it went very well. And then subsequently we started to run other conferences, including the Institute of Architects chapter conference in Queensland. And then the last job that I did was the annual general meeting for the surgeons, which is the largest medical meeting in Australia each year. I think there were about 700 people at the Gold Coast, and it was a huge project, and it went very well. And that, John Heron, who was the convener of that conference, knew that I was interested in going to the States, that I wanted to travel. Up until that point, I hadn't done what many of my contemporaries had done, go to England, because that's what you did in the mid-60s. Qantas was, jet setters. I hadn't done that. I'd had a trip to Indonesia, but nothing, excuse me, nothing beyond that. And I was much more interested in going to the United States than I was in going to England. Anyway, they gave me a kind of bonus at the end, and it was enough for my airfare, one way. So that was it. I took off in October 1979. And I had a round-the-world ticket that was open-ended, that was good for a year. And I got as far as Washington, D.C. And the next stop was London, and I still haven't been to London. I cashed in the ticket at the end of the 12 months, and that was it. When I went to the States, I was specifically interested in getting involved in the world of conference planning. I had no interest in pursuing an architectural career at all, and I was really on a different track, going in a different direction. And the College of Surgeons arranged for me to an introduction for me at the American College of Surgeons, which is based in Chicago. And the reason I went in October is that that's when they had their annual meeting. Now, they had something like 35,000 people at this in McCormick Place, and it was just boggled your mind, the scale of this thing. And I, had thoughts that maybe I could get a job working in their conference department, but it became very clear to me immediately that there was nothing there. I mean, they organised 700-person meetings every week, and so I moved on to Washington DC, where I had close friends and I was able to stay with them for an extended period of time. Eventually started working there in the public relations world. Met the woman who's now my wife, and that's it. So I come back for visits, but I've now been in the United States longer than I was in Australia.
So you now work across media, public relations.
I'm sorry.
Your work now.
I live now outside Philadelphia, in a town called Haddonfield, New Jersey. It's a small, very historic town. In fact, this year we're celebrating our 300th anniversary. Founded by Quakers, and it still has Quaker traditions that are quite strong. It's a dry town. In other words, there's no sale of alcohol in the town. You can bring it to a restaurant, but it's a dry town, and there's still a friend's meeting house and a friend's school. In fact, my daughter went to friend's school, and my for the last 20 years I've been publishing community newspapers,
right,
including a newspaper in Haddonfield and for some other communities as well. But before that, and still I'm active with marketing communications apart from that, advertising, publicity, those kinds of things.
Okay, we turn back then to your student days. So I guess we're interested in all aspects of student culture. One though, I guess, is the figure of the student leader. People tell us you were a student leader at the time. What did that mean in your generation? What was the culture that students required student leaders?
It was an extraordinary time, and I'm careful about saying that because I think everybody seems to think that their time was extraordinary, and for obvious reasons. But there's an exhibit touring the United States right now, and it was recently in Philadelphia, called 1968, and the subtitle is "The Year That Defined a Generation." Unfortunately, I missed seeing it, just accidentally, but there's a catalogue which I plan to get. And so, clearly the people who put this together recognised that there were things that happened that year in the United States and in the wider world that were transforming and defined the generation. That's when Martin Luther King was assassinated, Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. The Beatles' White Album was released. Laugh-In started on television. It was the year when The Graduate was released. It's the year when I think it was Apollo 8 took that photograph of the Earth that is just
on the whole
exactly. And lots of other things. So that was a time, and so the campus at the University of Queensland was right up there, and there were a couple of student leaders, Brian Laver and Dan O'Neill, especially the names that I'm thinking of, who were very strong. They were charismatic leaders. They were totally committed to what they believed in. And it It was happening all the time. I mean, you'd arrive on the campus in the morning and there's a new newsletter about things that are happening in the world and happening locally. And then the next day there's another one. I mean, they were churning out publications all the time. There were posters, there were meetings, there were rallies and so on. And it was impossible not to be aware of this. And you felt that you wanted to be a part of it. Now, there were some students, especially in a class of 72, who were totally focused on architecture, and that's a wonderful thing. But there are other students, and I was one of them, who found these extracurricular activities interesting and compelling. And so we did other things. We got involved in that student movement, but also got involved in student publications and student theatre and so on. And I've thought about this over the years, and it seemed to me that maybe one of the reasons that was the case is that there were not as many options for kids who were graduating from high school at the time who had that design interest, let me call it. It was kind of architecture or nothing. There wasn't a theatre, a tertiary theatre program in Brisbane. You had to go to Sydney or Melbourne. There wasn't an interior design course at that level.
Sure.
There wasn't stage design. There wasn't photography. There wasn't,
There's an art college, but a lot of middle-class parents didn't like their sons and
yes.
daughters to go to it.
Yes. And so people did architecture, even though they weren't. And you saw terrific kids who had real creativity, dropping out because they failed physics and chemistry. I mean, it was. So what they did to kind of retain their sanity, I suppose, was to get involved in other things, especially the architecture reviews, which were extraordinarily creative. Not just in terms of the skits themselves, but because they were architecture students, we had the ability to create fantastic sets, and so this was a wonderful rallying point as well. But those years in between 1960, probably 66, and 1970, on the campus of the University of Queensland it was volatile.
What were the issues that were big at the time, and what do you recall in terms of the sit-ins and the marches that you were involved in? I mean, was the war the primary issue?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yes, absolutely. And for many of us, this was a real learning experience, because we'd come out of sheltered households until 1969, when I was through my first 3 years, I was still at home with my parents. It wasn't until, and then they went away. They went overseas in 1970, and I had the house to myself. And the day before they came back, I moved out, and so I was on my way. But there were lots of students in their first, second, third years who still lived at home, and so you were part of that home environment. And if it was a conservative environment, then that was very dramatically different from what was happening on the campus. And of course your parents didn't understand that at all. And so the thought that you might become one of the radicals was horrific to them. And the thought that you might actually participate in a demonstration or a march was frightening to them. So there were tensions. And
the television news and current affairs would talk about the generation gap endlessly.
And it was vast at that time. So it was pretty difficult.
So there were a series of occupations of university premises around that time. Were you involved in any of those?
Not personally.
No.
And I think by comparison with some of the occupations in the States, in Berkeley, for example, they were relatively minor. but there were a number of marches, and there's one in particular that I remember. I'm not sure of the year, but I think it was on the 4th of July, and the date was deliberately chosen to, make a point about the United States. And it was a huge march, and it was from the campus through Toowong, along Coronation Drive, and into the city. And thousands of students participated, and staff. And what was interesting for us was that they decided, because of the number of people involved, to line everybody up alphabetically by faculty. And so architecture courses right near the front. Well, it turned out that the agricultural kids didn't come. they were probably at Gatton College or somewhere that day. And so when you looked at the list in the paper the next day of who was arrested, it was all the architecture students, because they were in the front lines. And so that was a kind of pretty serious shock.
And who were the staff members that went along with this?
Specifically I don't remember. But there were people like Bill Carr, for example, and Peter O'Gorman, who really had a student frame of mind in some respects. And certainly the students identified very closely with those two in particular. Ian Cinnamon also. And I wouldn't be surprised if Bill Carr and Peter O'Gorman were, if their name was in the newspaper the following day.
Was Brian Laver the marshal for that?
Yes, he would have been.
I think he was telling us about that at a previous event.
Yeah. Brian was out the front with a megaphone. He threw himself into the fray, and suffered physically, but also got the respect of a lot of people for his dedication and his ability to articulate. That, I think, was really important.
And were you arrested or beaten in that march?
No. It was... My memories of that are a little lacking. The thing that I remember most particularly was that it just happened that the architecture students were in the forefront, and some of the students ended up.
And at the university politics level, what were the other issues? I guess the war must have been the top one, but things about race politics in Australia and Aboriginal rights, the beginnings of feminism, labour issues. Were any of those up there, or was it all overshadowed by the war?
The war in Vietnam was, by no question, and that was the main motivating factor for everybody. But women's rights, the women's liberation movement and stuff was there. I don't really recall that issues for Australian Aboriginals was to the forefront at all.
The referendum had just been won, so it was...
Yeah, but that was what they called it, a nexus or something, I think. Was it giving the Aboriginals the right to vote? Was that
including them in the census, citizenship, basically?
Okay. Yeah. My recollection for that was that most of us thought that was just kind of what ought to happen, Yeah. And
it wasn't an issue you were campaigning on.
Yeah, I would think that people of my parents' generation generally would have voted in favour for that. It was just
an overwhelming majority.
Yeah. So I don't recall that we had specific issues around that.
What about the other level of politics, like Dan O'Neill, for instance, his position is very strongly Marxist. So did that sort of sense of Marxist politics, were you kind of aware of that? Do you think about that, or do you see it as a more broad protest movement?
I think it was broader, and I'm not sure that a lot of us understood the level of Dan's commitment there, or were particularly interested in it. that was too great a level of detail, and we weren't motivated by it, by overthrowing capitalism.
So there weren't sort of political groups in Mufti there, because I mean, when I was at university in the 70s, there's the National City Council, who were the right-wing interest group, and then there were Trotskyites, and they all formed themselves into different clubs and so on, but they were basically left and right-wing sort of political interest groups.
Right.
So that kind of level of like party politics wasn't.
I don't think so.
No.
The group was called SDA, Students for Democratic Action, and Brian was the leader of that, and Dan was in there, other guys as well, of course. And in some ways, I think it was modelled on SDS in the United States, Students for Democratic Society. So I don't remember that kind of party level of activity at all.
You said that the march was on the 4th of July, so it was really framing into global issues and
Yes.
into global opposition against the Vietnam War. But was there also amongst the students this rebellion against the local Queensland government at
Sure.
the time?
Oh yes.
And how was that expressed, or how?
Yeah, well, the Queensland government at that time was very repressive. You had to get a permit to have a march, and of course the permits weren't granted, and you couldn't carry placards that were on bits of wood because you might stab somebody with, beat them over the head with stuff like that, and so on. And the police were pretty brutal. There was a group called the Special Branch that used to raid students' houses from time to time, and so on. And so there was certainly a lot of rage against the government of the day, and I think it's also important to acknowledge that there has to be an element here of a crowd mentality, that people went along because that's the way crowds work, and the number of people who were committed was probably relatively small. But there was a significant number of supporters, and then there were a bunch of people who kind of went along for the ride, but there was generally a feeling that the world was changing. Things were happening in the United States, in France, of course, in England and Germany and so on, and that Australia was naturally a part of that. And as a student, you wanted to be a part of that because it was exciting.
And did you feel as a Queensland student that there was a difference between you and the students from New South Wales or Victoria, that they were more at the forefront of this action? Or
No, not at all. No. You were conscious of what was happening in those other states because it was in the newspapers generally. And from time to time, someone might visit from another state and they give a speech at lunchtime in the refectory or wherever. No, the same kind of thing that was happening on the campus in Queensland, I think, was happening on the major campuses in the other cities.
But there wasn't a sense that because the state government was known to be more right-wing and more repressive, that the situation here was more tense than
in other states?
Yeah.
I really can't recall that. But Brian and Dan would happily have overthrown the Queensland government if they could have, and we would have been at the barricades with them, I think, because you could see that there was in fact police brutality. There's no question about that, but fundamentally it was just kind of unfair. Here were people who believed in certain things, and they wanted a forum to express their beliefs, and they were being denied the ability to do that. But that was the way things operated at that time.
And do you think that, you said there was this feeling that society was changing, do you think that also influenced how architecture students were looking at modernism that had been built before, and how you were thinking about what to design and what the role of an architect was, and what the importance of designing a house or design?
Well, absolutely. That was another interesting thing about the end of the 60s, because I think when we came into the university for me in '96, there had been a number of buildings built a few years before that were very different from what had been built before. I mean, domestically, Hayes and Scott, had done all that significant work, and John Railton was doing houses, and John Dalton and Morris Hurst, and so on. So they were producing houses that were very different from the houses that had been built in the 50s. And then in the more public world, Jim Birrell did the car park and the swimming pool. Union College had a huge influence on my thinking about it. And then, of course, he did the...
It's interesting because Union College is architecturally significant, but the fact that it was the first non-denominational college on campus was politically important in the university's history, because all the other ones were based on religious denominations.
Exactly.
So it was actually an agnostic or non-religious college.
Yeah. And then there was is it the vet school, the brick?
Yeah, the Seddon buildings.
Building.
The Birrell building, the agriculture building.
Agriculture, the brick building that is on the approach.
Hartley Teakles.
Yeah. I mean, that blew everybody away at the time. And so...
Do you know the story Jim tells about the burnt bricks?
No.
He was he made it out of those spoiled bricks that had magnesium burn on it, and they were very cheap.
Yes.
And the building committee hated the idea.
Yes.
But he laid them all out on the ground.
Yes.
And took the committee there. And the National Gallery just bought blue poles, and he said, "This is like Jackson Pollock." Oh, right, well, it's the latest thing, we must have it.
It's all about sound. And then Robin Gibson, of course, was doing interesting stuff with brass and glass and black bean, right? And so as an architecture student, you could look out into the world of Brisbane, and you could see exciting buildings going up. So that was interesting in that sense. So, and then of course what happened was, within the school, that Cummings and Lucas retired, and so that was kind of the old guard moving on, and Gareth came in, and I'm pretty sure that was 68, at the beginning of 68, at age 39. A planner from Canberra. So, he had someone who was young that students kind of identified with in a way that they maybe hadn't with the older generation. And so there was this promise of at least the possibility of change within the school. And of course what also happened then was that the 5-year course came in as well. So within the School of Architecture there was change, and so we saw as students this opportunity to maybe advance some of our ideas. Now, on the national level, the Australasian Institute of Architects had a particularly dynamic secretary, Ian Godfrey, who lived in Melbourne, and so we were very conscious of things that were happening in the other schools, and of course the AASA ran the conferences. My first year, the conference, I think, was in Brisbane. When was Brisbane?
67.
67. Okay, 66 was Perth, I think, and some students went to Perth. So 67, I was in second year, and so that was great because you're still a young student, but suddenly you're attending this thing with students from all around
Was that the one that Fuller was at?
In Perth? Yeah. No, that was Sydney, I think.
No, Bucky Fuller came to the Sydney conference, which was in 1970. So it was Perth and then Brisbane, and then the one that I went to was the next one, which was in Hobart. And on the way to Hobart, I stopped in Canberra. In fact, Gareth introduced me to Dirk Bolt, who was a Dutch architect who had lived in and worked in Hobart, and at that time was working in Canberra. And I stopped there on the way, and then because he was one of the speakers at Hobart, and Dirk and I subsequently became very close friends. And then the year after that was Adelaide, and then the year after that was Sydney. So I was at all of those conventions. But
so you had a lot of experience before you became involved in the Brisbane conference.
No, Brisbane conference was the first 67 second year.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. The Brisbane conference, I think I merely kind of attended. I guess and that's when I started to become active in student affairs, really. And these were all in May, so there was still plenty of time after the conference to get involved and stuff. And then in the year ahead of me, there were 6 girls, and Lecky Ord was one of them. And Lecky and I became very close friends, and she ended up marrying Ian Godfrey. And moving to Melbourne. In fact, she finished her degree in Melbourne. And so there was this kind of dynamic duo in Melbourne that was doing things nationally, and I was kind of the Queensland guy. And then there was a guy in Peter Hale at the University of Sydney, and John Byrne, who was at the University of Adelaide, and so on. So in each city there was at least one person who was really kind of active, very active in terms of meetings and publications, and talking with the administration about changes that students were interested in making to the courses and stuff. So the association was working the way that it should.
And at the Brisbane conference, you said you attended it. That was also at that conference the first time the so-called happening took place. Did you attend that happening? I forget where it took place, where they kind of smashed a car and had chickens on stage and things like that.
You've heard about that?
Yes. Were you there? And
I was. It was in the theatre in West End.
Yeah. And
what was that called? Not sure.
On Highgrove Road, the Rialto.
Yes.
Was it the Rialto?
Yeah.
Yeah. It was fun. it was shocking. It was all those kinds of things. I mean, I remember that vividly. I was in the audience. But what I remember particularly was that a couple of days after that, we were all down the Gold Coast, I think in the Broadbeach Hotel. And I'll come back to that because I have another story about the Broadbeach Hotel. And a lot of people were very upset about what had happened or what they thought had happened. And what had appeared to happen was that a car came onto the stage, and then somebody who I won't name came on swinging a couple of chickens by the feet, and which may have happened and may not have happened. I don't know whether in fact it did. But it appeared that they started beating the car with these poor chooks. And people walked out. It was right at the end of the show. People left and people were shocked and so on. And it was probably in the news, in the Truth or whatever it was, within a few days. But a few days later, we were down in the Broadbeach Hotel, and there was a discussion of this. People really wanted to talk about it, and many people were outraged about it. And John Dalton spoke up, and he said, if you think back to things that have happened in the history that you've been learning of architecture and art and so on, think of all of the times when somebody did something that was outrageous at the time, that now we take for granted, and that we're kind of glad that that happened because it helped the movement move forward. And that was a shocking statement to many students. But it resonated with me. It gave me a different perspective on, not just on that, but on things generally. That oftentimes, you get outraged about something, but then if you can stand back from it and try to put it in context, it's maybe not what you kind of thought it was. It's not as terrible as you thought it was. So that was interesting. Since I mentioned the Broadbeach thing, I'll just mention one other thing, that early on when I was in first year, Bill Carr took us on a road trip to Surfers Paradise. So we all piled in everybody else's cars, and so the $70 went down to Surfers Paradise. And we sat down in a park, and Bill talked about the reason that he had organised this. He said, I want you to stroll around for a couple of hours and come back with some drawings of things that you've seen that you think are funny or humorous or whatever. And I remember that a couple of other guys and I found a chair that you would it was a Barney Rubble car on the sidewalk that you could put money in and take a ride. This is probably in March or something, I mean, we'd only just started the course. I was still wearing a tie. And so we did drawings of each other sitting in this car. And then we all reassembled, came back, and everyone laid their drawings out. And there were a couple of kids, and I think Michael Durack was one. And Michael was like Ashley Talbot I mentioned before, who just could draw, and he had a drawing of the Broadbeach Hotel. And he was one of the few students that had drawn a building. And that was what Bill was looking for. He was trying to get us to understand that architecture has good and bad, that it has humour and so on. And obviously I still remember that, and I think that all of us learned a lesson that day. And we learned that when we were in this course, we were supposed to be thinking like architects, about architecture, and not as high school kids thinking about Barney Rubble, So that was an interesting lesson.
What did you think? Were you encouraged to think about the early generation, about Lucas and Cummings and Langer and people like that? I mean, were their buildings well received?
Oh, I think so. Karl Langer was very well respected, I think, and his buildings were well known. The work that Lucas and Cummings had done, I personally wasn't particularly familiar with, and we didn't really see much of them. I don't know that I ever had a lecture from Bruce Lucas, and I don't know that I ever had a lecture from Cummings either, and that I was kind of conscious of their work. I think when we came in, we knew that they were about to retire, and that was that, and things were changing. So.
And the things you were doing, because at the slideshow yesterday we saw these living pods that you were designing.
Yeah.
Was that influenced by Tony Gwilliam coming, or the work of Archigram? And was the whole idea that maybe you needed a living pod in a post-apocalyptic world when they dropped the bomb, or was that inspired by things?
Well, that was actually not my year. That was done by Peter Bycroft, you and Paul Memory, the guys who were the year behind me. So I didn't participate in that project as a student, but as a student leader, I was part of promoting that. And of course, Tony Gwilliam was there at the time. In fact, I had a photo here. Yeah, that's this is Tony. Here we'd given him a slouch hat, and this is me, I think, and Lecky Ord.
Right.
And that's down. I was going to say it was down by the lake, but I'm not sure exactly where that was. Tony Gwilliam had a great influence on the full-time students, and the exercise of building those domes. And I think last night, when that photograph came on of the domes in front of the main building, there was a kind of a cheer in the crowd, whereas the rest of the time people were kind of listening intently. You could tell that was something that galvanised the students, and it did. It was a fabulous exercise, not just in terms of the building of the structure and understanding, but also of what we had to do in getting the materials. which we had donated. I mean, we talked to suppliers and convinced them to donate this stuff and so on. And so that particular event, the building of the domes in the Great Court, was a fabulous exercise. The pods, for me, were interesting, but in some ways kind of disappointing. The quality of them was varied. And Peter himself and I were talking about that a couple of days ago and laughing about how bad the one was that he personally was involved in. I think he was kind of embarrassed by it. But others were very interesting.
Did you connect that activity back to the avant-garde culture in Britain and Europe?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And
so was William lecturing about Martha Graham?
Yes. And Cedric Price came out to Hobart, I think. And Australians at that time, young Australians, were very focused on the UK. Qantas had this program that was called Jet Setters, and it was kind of up and away, and so if you were under a certain age, I think you could get this really cheap fare to London, and there were so many Australians in London that you could find a bed and a bit of floor, and so lots of young Australians were flying to London. It was Carnaby Street and the psychedelic thing and all that kind of stuff. Well, very, very exciting kind of stuff. And so people like Cedric Price and Tony William were generating all of these fantastic ideas and producing magazines and stuff like that. And then Haig Beck, who was a student at QIT, went over and lived in London and started getting involved in the publishing world, and I think he ended up as the publisher of Architectural Design.
Did you?
And you think, boy, how did that happen? And so that was, but Tony Gwilliam really opened people's eyes to all kinds of stuff. And then when Bucky Fuller came out to the Sydney convention, and Gwilliam had worked with Bucky Fuller in the States, that made us think of all kinds of things were possible.
Obviously, you went to the States for other reasons later on to do with your later career, but were things like the Whole Earth Catalogue and Drop City, was it a different version of alternative architectural culture coming out of the States? Did you see a difference between British high-tech and American hippie culture? Was that something?
Yes, they did seem to be different. Yeah, they really did. The British thing was really focused on the culture. It was focused on music and building and all that kind of stuff. You didn't get the impression that the English were hippies. Whereas you certainly did get the impression that the Americans were hippies and communes and so on. So when everybody went down to Nimbin or wherever they went for that kind of Woodstock thing, that was an American influence. That was not British influence at all.
Very much libertarian philosophy.
Yes.
It's interesting that the British versus American thing, because Barry Waldock told me that his generation thought that Lucas and Cummings and Langer were boring because their buildings were heavy.
Yes.
And they were interested in case study houses.
Right.
And Hayes and Scott's sources seem to be all American, basically.
Yes.
Breuer.
Yep.
And there does seem to be a gap in that generation between people who, apparently Cummings was lecturing on Dudok right until the day he retired.
Absolutely. Yep.
There's sort of sense of,
right.
of British brick modernism based on Scandinavian and Low Countries modernism.
Yes. But then
was seen as old hat compared to what's happening in California and New England.
Yeah. But then Bucky Fuller kind of came up with
that.
What does a building weigh?
Yeah.
So, and so Tony Gwilliam, I guess, brought that all together. But Tony was a charismatic guy, and the way he dressed, he had he's probably wearing it here. He had this jacket, he's got it on here with these huge pockets because he wanted to be able to carry a magazine in his pockets, And so for us, think, hey, that makes sense. Why not have a jacket? It's got to be, you can carry stuff in it and stuff like that.
You mentioned the curriculum changes that the Students' Associations was involved in here and nationally. What were the kinds of changes you were pushing for?
It's hard for me to remember that. And in a way, I think that it was more being interested in trying to be involved in decision making generally. That students wanted a voice.
Okay.
and wanted to be rather than being lectured at from Rayner Banham, those Lewis Mumford and so on, wanted to talk about what it was that we were being taught, what was being presented, and wanted to participate in framing our curriculum. And I think that for a few of us, the fact that in first year we did, I think it was physics with a lecturer from the physics department, and second year was chemistry with a lecturer from the chemistry department, just made no sense at all. We were doing organic chemistry, for God's sake. And kids were failing, dropping out of architecture because they failed those subjects. It made no sense, and yet the administration didn't seem to be kind of thinking about that at all. And so those were maybe the kinds of things that we were trying to do, was to say, look, let's have a course here that's a bit more realistic or a bit more relevant. There were some students, for instance, who were interested in writing about architecture, who wanted to become critics. Then there was nothing in the course about architectural criticism and so on. So that anybody who did any writing at that time was pretty naive about what they wrote and learned on the road, which is what I did, and that's how I ended up doing a lot of writing.
Another thing interests us, I guess, is the rise in interest in cultural heritage and the older buildings of Brisbane.
Yeah.
In that same year, Dick Stringer had his first photographic show, and it was a sort of old sandstone public buildings, but a lot of timber and tin houses. And apparently this is meant to be a confrontation against the Institute conference, because the Institute members were busy pulling this kind of stuff down.
Right.
So was that kind of ethos of like respect for the history of the built environment, was that something that came across in your period?
Well, I personally had some involvement there, and it began with Neville Lund. And I think what had probably happened was that the architectural student publications that we were producing, and that I was played a significant role in producing, we sent to the profession. We would mail them out to the architectural offices as well. I remember going along to the office that was on Coronation Drive at the time and addressing the things, and the Institute would mail them actually at their expense. And so we were able to get the student message out to the profession. We thought that was important. And one day I think I got a call from Neville Lund saying that the National Trust of Australia was going to be producing a book called Historic Public Buildings of Australia, and that they were considering including St Martin's Hospital as one of those public buildings. And he wondered whether I'd be interested in writing the chapter on St Martin's Hospital. And Dick, of course, had some wonderful photographs of the building. And this would have been in late 1969 and 1970, I remember. And I sort of was taken aback, because here am I, just a kind of a student, not knowing much, and not necessarily, I don't know that I was much of a writer. But here was Neville Lund asking me if I would like to write this, and so I did, and it was published. In fact, the chapter on St Martin's was the last chapter in the book, and the only post-World War I building. And I think Dick Stringer said at the time that it would have been very easy for them to use World War I as a cut-off. But they found the chapter on St Martin's so compelling. And
it was a war memorial hospital too.
It was, yes.
Founded in 1919.
Yes. And so that it was included. Now I went to Melbourne for the launch and all that kind of stuff. So I had that. And then, of course, St Martin's was under threat. And there was a meeting held at St Margaret's School. And I was invited to speak at that meeting about the architectural aspect of the thing. And there were half a dozen other people up on the stage. Petronelle White, who was a member of City Council or the State Government, I'm not sure. Anyway, and John Greenwood, who was a barrister, lives down the road here now, and a number of other people who spoke. There was a large crowd, and people were kind of agitated that the church was planning to close the hospital for various reasons. And the meeting was coming to an end and everybody was about to leave, and suddenly somebody jumped up from the audience and said, "I move that everybody on the stage form a committee to keep this thing going." And everybody kind of yelled and cheered, and so suddenly there was a committee, and which became the Save St Martin's Committee. And John Greenwood was the chair of that. There were Murray Elliott, who was a OBGYN, Roger Solder, an OBGYN, some other doctors, Bob Badgery, a solicitor, and I. And I think Dick Stringer was part of that as well. And we used to meet at the office that Michael and I had on Boundary Street. And I don't know if you know the history of this, but we ended up in the Supreme Court after years of battling against the church, and we won and we lost. We won in that it was ruled in effect that the building had to stay. We lost in effect in that it no longer had to be a hospital.
Yeah, demolished the nurses' quarters.
Yes, and so from an architectural point of view, people were thrilled. From the point of view of the extraordinary care that Society of Sisters had given over many years, that was a major loss. But of course, by that time the hospital had been shuttered, it closed, and so restarting anything would have been difficult anyway.
Well, that's a great story. I was thinking about the broader issue, the Queensland House, which is one of the things that interests us, and it seems like through the 40s and 50s, everyone was taught that they were terrible.
Yes,
because the thermally formed badly thermally, and Langer had a big thing about glare and the unusable depth of the veranda and the darkness inside, and this kind of stuff. But it's about your time that people started to be interested in these things.
Yes.
And I think at the conference we found records of Bill Carr having given some talk about how the pre-cut houses of Brisbane were some of the first industrialised prefab buildings, and how you could draw a line between pre-cut houses in Brisbane and contemporary issues in architecture and prefabrication. Any of those?
I don't have any recollection of that, but I do have recollection of several houses that were threatened and that ended up going down. In fact, a couple of days ago, when I was going through my piles of stuff at my sister's house, I came across photographs of the Earnshaw house. It was Robin Dodd's house at Clayfield, and these photos I took was after it had been vacated and may have been partly demolished. And I've got a message into Bob Riddell to see if he's interested in having those. I also I came across a publication that I think I produced at a time when a Dodd's house in New Farm was on the auction block, and I know that I and other students went to that, maybe even with placards. I don't specifically
recall. In Abbott Street. There were two side by side, one for himself and one for Specky.
Probably, I don't specifically, but there's no question it was a significant house.
Yeah.
It may have, I haven't actually looked at this. And of course it was bought by a developer and it was gone.
Yeah, that was Doss's.
Yes, and so architecture students were very conscious of that heritage, and got out and tried to make the point that it was something that needed to be considered in a different way.
That's great. I guess we passed over a minute ago. You talked about the publications you'd made. We should probably get you to say what those publications were.
At the university, well, there was one that Haig Beck was doing that was called ASM, Architecture Students Magazine, and I remember that I had a piece in one of those with photograph about student organisation and so on, and the student association at that time in the first few years was a combined university QIT association, and we used to meet in the chapter headquarters on Coronation Drive. And so probably I think by the time I got into third year, the two schools felt that they wanted to do stuff themselves. And I don't know exactly how that came about, what was the motivation for that. But instead of QASA, which was Queensland Architecture Students Association, we formed QUASA, Queensland University. And they formed some other association. And maybe not even that. I think the student body at that time was maybe a little thin in terms of its organisation. But Lecky and I were in their boots and all at the university, and some other students like Rick Lambourne and so on. And so we started that. And I think the first publication we had was actually called Number, because so the first one was number 1 and the second one was number 2. It was just kind of, why not call it that? And then subsequently there was another publication that was called Mark II, MK2, as in the second version. And I managed to get a company called Robin Brown, I don't know if they're still around, but they were a building manufacturing company on Kangaroo Point, to provide funding so that we could afford to print that and distribute it. And they were, very supportive. It was important for us to do that. And various students contributed various things, photographs, articles, and so on. So the ones I gave you last night are some examples of that. I have others that I'm happy to get to you. And incidentally, typically those publications were printed on the press that was also printing the flyers for SDA. So they'd do this revolutionary, to the barricades message in the morning, and they'd do this Architecture Students magazine in the afternoon.
I guess the other event that interests us a lot is Art Experience Week.
Mm.
And we know quite a lot about that now because we managed to get the top secret confidential report on it the university made at the time released to us.
Okay.
So we kind of know all the kind of basic sort of facts, or at least what Bill Carr and Bill Gregg told the university about what had happened, and we've talked to quite a lot of people
and
about it.
And what year was that?
72.
See, in 72 I was out of it.
Mm.
Right.
I don't mean
Yeah.
I mean that I wasn't at the I may have still been enrolled, I'm not sure, but I wasn't attending anything.
Mm.
I dropped out in 71.
Right.
I've got a feeling that I might have attended something just because it was of interest, but I wasn't a participant.
Okay.
And was that the event with Bill, with Joan Carr? No.
No,
Tim
there's
Johnson,
Tim Johnson and
Albie
his,
Thomas.
Yeah, no, I really don't know anything about that.
there's a lot of nudity and eroticism and breaking of light bulbs. And it caused a huge scandal because the university looked at dismissing Bill Carr over it.
Well, maybe this is the same thing I'm thinking of. I just thought that was earlier.
It was at the old Masonic Hall on Alice Street opposite the Gardens.
Okay.
The first parts of it.
Yeah. I certainly recall that there was an issue with Bill, and there were accusations about his wife Joan.
Oh, I haven't heard that.
Yeah, let me think about that and maybe see. I thought that what I'm talking about was earlier than this other event, several years earlier.
Was it that he was taking students to his bedroom?
No.
That was not that.
No.
Where his wife was there and they were teaching from the bed. Yeah, somebody told that story.
Wow, it's like John and Yoko.
Yes.
Well,
I think that was probably the inspiration.
well, there might have been a mentality for that, certainly. I mean, Bill and Joan were wonderful people, and I spent a considerable amount of time with them at their house.
Mm.
And he had a way of of teaching you something very significant, but doing it in a very subtle way or a very cryptic way. And maybe you didn't get it at the time, but you got it afterwards. And it's a little bit like that Broadbeach story I was telling you before. Most students, I'm probably not going to say all, but most students, I think, really loved him because he was on their side. Bill was a lecturer. There was no question that he was ever going to get beyond that because the administration just didn't know how to deal with him. But he was an educated man, and with a very broad.
Yeah, he would have been one of the few people in Brisbane at the time who knew about fluxus.
And his money apparently came from his family, and it was from bitumen, macadam. Is this meaning?
Story I heard was his family were they had the contract for night soil collection in Melbourne, and they were wealthy from that.
Okay.
I don't know what they were in by the time Bill was about, but
Yeah.
they're an old Melbourne family with resources.
That may be, and I have no basis for what I'm saying except that I'm not sure if Bill told me that, but whatever.
Yeah, no, someone else. There's all these rumours going about.
But Bill had Norman Lindsay originals on his wall at home, and the furniture he had was just fabulous furniture and stuff. And Joan was a wonderful character as well. And of course, he drove an Alfa Romeo, which for architecture students would have been the ultimate, until the Mini Moke came along.
By the time he taught me, he was driving a very decayed Jaguar Mark I, like one of those big saloon.
Oh, really?
That was like rusting to bits with plants
Okay.
growing out of the boot, and it was a very odd car.
Yeah. Bill was still alive, as far as I know, when I left to the States, and I lost contact with him. But I did come across a note that he wrote to me in 1970 about a personal matter that was just spot on.
What happened with cover, do you mean?
I think we've covered most of the things. Well, the student reviews, I don't know if you... Well,
The student reviews, I was very involved with those, not on stage. Typically I was involved in the business management and the publicity and all that kind of stuff, so did programs and front of house stuff and so on.
but you attended them.
Oh, of course, every single performance. And Ralph Tyrrell was in my year, and Nev Twydale and Graham Davis was the year after me. These guys who were in the band, and they produced wonderful music, and movies. There's a movie called The Red Balloon. I don't know if you know
Somebody
that.
told us about it yesterday, but we haven't
Seen that.
Yeah,
It
we'll
was
have
just
you
this
get it.
delightful little movie, and you had guys like Ross Gilbert, who really was John Belushi. I mean, he was out, and we didn't, because Belushi was not invented yet, but he was John Belushi, and Max Banner and these guys who just did brilliant stuff.
But it was William Young wrote the sketches, and do you remember what the performances were about?
Well, typically it was a series of skits, and there was one thing where there were a couple of Asian students created a papier-mâché elephant. It was only half of the elephant because you didn't need the other half because you only saw the one half. And they had it upside down on a pole and carried it across the stage, and that was it. There was nothing else. So the audience is sitting there, the lights, there's gone dark, the lights come up, and this elephant is carried across the stage upside down. And you spent the rest of the evening waiting for the elephant to come back. And for something that it never did. And so then on reflection you think, that was just brilliant. And after the whole thing was over, because the review would run for a week or whatever, I don't know, the elephant was burned. And that was the kind of culmination of the whole thing. So they put an enormous amount of work into this thing for 10 seconds. And did you got a copy of the calendar that we
Yes.
did? Yeah.
Yes.
So Ron Berry and I took a whole bunch of photographs of this particular one called a Wop Bopaloo Bopalop Bam Boom, and decided to turn it into a calendar that we subsequently sold and made no money on. But we sold a lot. I mean, students just sort of lapped that up. And that for me was actually the start of me getting into graphic design and publishing and so on. So that was important personally for me to do that. As I think I said before, the thing about the architecture reviews, by comparison with some other theatrical productions that were done, were especially good because the architecture students were so visual and had the ability to create stunning sets or elephants, and so on.
But they were not political in nature. They were not focusing on architecture.
There were, there was reflection on the politics of the time, and I remember, in fact, in the front of in that calendar, there's a photograph of I think Max Banner with a big Z on his chest, so for Zelman Cowan, and there was stuff like that. But there were ones about all kinds of things, just like a typical review. I mean, there was sex, of course, and there was drugs, and there was rock and roll. What more is there? And maybe not that much about architecture. I don't think it was an architectural review, and that was done by the architecture student. It wasn't an architectural review in terms of being that was the subject matter. No, it was just an outlet for creativity, and as I was saying before, that many of the students who participated in that never finished their architectural course. That's what their calling was. Tony Rose, went on to be, I think, an understudy in Jesus Christ Superstar in Sydney. That kind of blew us all away. Ralph Tyrrell, was in the music world, and so on. And Willie Young, I don't know if Willie may well have graduated. I don't know, but I think he's
very
he's now a photographer.
He's a very prominent artist.
Yes. So that's the way it is.
Great.
There's one other thing I remember, actually, just in the same line, and it tied in with the demonstrations as well. I think there was an exhibit or something that featured some Beardsley prints, some of those erotic prints, and the administration was particularly unhappy about it. And there was a guy whose name was Colonel Gurman. He was a military man, and he was, I don't know what his title was, but he was full-time, and he was kind of Zelman's number 2.
The registrar or the bursar or something?
He was kind of the enforcer.
Strangely enough, we have a retired Army Major General in that role.
Oh, really?
At the university.
Yeah, okay. Well, he was Colonel Gurman. And maybe he'd been brought on when the student demonstrations were getting underway to give the university advice on how to manage these kinds of things.
So there's an exhibition of Beardsley Yellow Book kind of stuff at the school.
I don't know where it was. It might have been in the student union or wherever. But anyway, they were unhappy about it, and maybe the administration wanted to shut it down. So there was a rally, because you could get a rally about that kind of thing, and a number of speakers. And Gurman spoke eloquently about why this was inappropriate. But then you had Brian Laver and Dan O'Neill giving the other side of it, and which to us was the right side. And suddenly, up on top of the building overlooking the student union was Ross Gilbert, naked, for about 10 seconds. Now, I knew that it was going to happen because it was my job to direct everybody's attention to the fact that he was there, because we were all looking the other way.
And how did you do that?
You see? But Gurman, of course, was speaking, and he was facing that building. And I remember the look on his face because Ross was a swarthy kind of guy, and it was just one of those. It was like the elephant, it was one of those wonderful moments in time. It was that encapsulated everything. So, although we were raging about the war, there was still the ability to, have a sense of humour about what was going on, and it was a wonderful thing. So thank you for inviting me to talk with you. I
David,
hope
thanks
it's
so much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
been helpful.